Okay, this is a really important video for the X-H1. I have the X-T2 over here. If you actually notice, we're in the shooting settings menu, page 1. We're in IS mode. We have options of continuous and shooting only, and as you very well know, on the X-T2 we have IS mode and shooting settings, which is default set to 1, continuous, and 2, shooting only. With a key distinction here, and let's actually mention the owner's manual. And here we have the IS mode for reduction blur, and obviously continuous image stabilization is always on. Shooting is the shutter release button is pressed halfway. That's in continuous autofocus, but the actual in-body image stabilization in conjunction with, depending on if you're using an image stabilized lens, is engaged at the last second. In other words, the image is not stabilized until you actually start to take the shot. Obviously, off is off. You'll actually find that nowhere in the manual, absolutely nowhere, is there any mention of the fact that there is a stabilized IBIS sensor in the X-H1 camera. First, let's talk about the X-T2 and let's talk about the X-H1 for the distinction and when to use which and why. Obviously, there are charts out there already concerning how many stops of image stabilization, depending on which Fujifilm lens it is, whether it's an OIS lens or not, and whether it has optical image stabilization or not. In continuous mode, which is default on the X-T2, this is for shooting longer, much longer telephoto lenses, but for also specifically, importantly, very slow shutter speed shooting, low light conditions, say below 1/60th of a second. We can't say 1/60th of a second, 1/100th of a second. Shooting really slow shutter speeds. Shooting only. Number 2 is the easiest way to remember it is 2 is for too fast. So if you're shooting outdoors, you want to stabilize the image, say 1/125th of a second, 1/500th, 1/1000th of a second. As is the case with Nikon and Canon, including Fujifilm, image stabilization not only nulls out shake for the shot taken, but it can induce that. And one of the key things that I've found in pointing out to people that were using the really long telephoto 100 to 400 millimeter Fujifilm lens on their X-T2 is they say, well, you know, there's something wrong with this lens, that I get way too high of a blur issue with my 100 or 400 millimeter Fujifilm lens. There must be an issue with it. And what they did is they never switched out of the default factory mode, which is IS mode 1, which is continuous. And if you're shooting, you know, bird photography, for example, 1/250th of a second, 1/500th of a second, so on and so forth, above 1/60th of a second, or we can't say above 1/125th of a second, you need to be in shooting mode 2, in which obviously the image is not stabilized. And I know people want to see a stabilized image right before they take the shot for obvious reasons, but you want to be shooting in shooting mode 2, where the actual engagement of stabilization, since this is an X-T2 and there's an in-body image stabilization, where the actual lens stabilization, or the OIS, is only engaged at the last fraction of a second. And the same thing applies on the X-H1, continuous and shooting only, continuous and shooting only. Like I said, there's no mention in the camera menu, nor is there absolutely any. You will not find the words IBIS or sensor stabilization, and I've read this manual 3 or 4 times already. There's no mention of a stabilized sensor in the owner's manual. None whatsoever. The key point to remember is that the X-H1, even though it has a stabilized sensor, and whether you are or not using a stabilized lens, and these work in conjunction with themselves based upon the firmware that is installed on the X-H1, that the X-H1 operates identical to the X-T2, even though there's a dual stabilization in the X-H1. Continuous is still for video. In this case, video, obviously you want continuous stabilization, so that's different. But for photography's sake, you still want to be shooting continuous stabilization in much slower shutter speeds. In other words, if you're shooting 1/250th of a second, 1/125th of a second, you want to be shooting in IS mode, shooting only. And this is no different for use and engagement than the X-T2, even though there's only one stabilization here, potentially that being the lens only. In the case over here, potentially, depending on the lens you're using, in this case I do, we have the 80mm, which is stabilized, and we have, obviously, in-body image stabilized sensor. The same thing applies, even though there is dual stabilization here. The only distinction being is if you're shooting video, obviously you want continuous on. And so that's it. That's the salient point. It is not mentioned in the owner's manual. It should say that, but it does not. It says shooting only or last minute stabilization is for shooting faster shutter speeds. Continuous is for all video for obvious and logical reasons, and for slower photography. 1/60th of a second, 1/10th of a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/60th of a second. So that is the only place for photography's sake where you want to have continuous on. We all like to see a stabilized image all the time, but it is the case with Nikon and Canon and Fujifilm and Sony and everybody else that stabilization, whether it's in-body image stabilization via the sensor or stabilization with the lens or both, the stabilization not only nulls out shake, and this is not my opinion, it's a hardcore fact, stabilization can induce shake. Okay, so the same thing applies to the X-T2 as it also applies to the new Fujifilm X-H1. This is a really key important point. And I hope you like these videos. If you do, click the link below. You can always make a small donation. Tell me to jump off a cliff, whatever makes you happy. I am out now to go shooting with the X-H1. I've cranked about 7,000 shots through it, and I'm going to go to the wildlife preserve and shoot my X-H1. Thank you so much. I absolutely love the hell out of this camera. I'll be talking about the reasons why, and not fanboy talk, but oh my god, I love this camera. Completely ignoring IBIS, which I know how wonderful that has been for video. I've been testing that and for really low light shooting on non-stabilized lenses, but absolutely love the camera for so many reasons unrelated to IBIS, and that is important to me. Maybe important to you, but this is my video, not your video. Thanks so much for watching, and catch you later.